only the speaker. Put this on speaker view somewhere. And I wish us all a pleasant evening. Thank you. Over to Ainsley.
Thank you, Ton. That was nice. That was nice. But I do have other disciplines other than just doing international trading. I did start life on a plantation. So I do know how to grow bananas. I do know how to measure or identify the bananas. And Harry Belafonte's 6-hand, 7-hand, 8-hand bunch is something I was practiced with. I can't sing though.
That's too bad. To start, I mean, can you tell us how you got involved in genealogy?
I started life with 3 mothers. My mother divorced my father before I even knew him. And so I grew up with my grandaunt and my grandmother and my mother and a younger brother. And all that time, my grandmother was from a totally different background. My grandmother was born in the Ukraine in a village for an Orthodox Jewish family that migrated at the end of the 19th century to America. And how she married my grandfather is another story. So my grandfather and my grandmother from my mother's side was a story that was not just straight Jamaican. On my father's side, it's also another very similar situation. So I started with my grandmother, who was one of 13 when I first got the software, the Brothers Keeper, somewhere about 30 years ago. And by the time I got to about 40, 50, 60 people, that's not hard with a grandmother with 12 siblings. I then eventually discovered, quite fascinatingly, that her grandmother was aunt of Rabbi Henry Pereira Mendez. Now, when you find that, that's a wow experience. And that causes you to stay up until the wee hours of the morning trying to discover who the Pereira Mendez family was. And that continues even up to today. So that was one of the interesting experiences that brought me into the idea that, you know, I was connected to some other people. And then subsequently, through my mother's father, I discovered that one of his ancestors was a Belinfanti. And who were the Belinfantis? Rabbi Isaac Belinfanti's ancestors fled Portugal in 1497 and went to Istanbul. And I'm a descendant of that journey. So, wow, that's another big story. So that helps to push me into a situation where today I have a database in the tens of thousands, 26,000 people in the database. Now I'll tell you why. Part of it was simply because as I found a relation to any of my relatives, I then started to do their ancestry and I followed their ancestry. So in a sense, I have collections of people that they don't even know that they're connected to. And that's really part of the fascination of what I've been able to achieve, not for any particular reason, out of nothing more than intellectual interest. And it has brought me to understand a number of very interesting things about the sociology of the 350 odd years of Jamaican or Jews in Jamaica, plus going back into where I could find records. And what I would share with you is that I have a complete set of the Bevis Mask records. I also have Rabbi Stern's book. So there you have another story. And now I'm working with Rabbi Emmanuel from Curacao. I didn't pick it up before because those books are almost impossible to find, but I'm very friendly with the Curacao people. And I see Ron online, so I say, hi, Ron. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on. And then you have other people who have done important family histories. And Stephen Delgado, I recognize also because his work on the Delgado family or Delgado family in Jamaica is outstanding. And then there's also other work too, because the Lindo family was a significant family in Jamaica. Apart from anything else, one of them was a major slave trader, but we won't call his name other than to identify his surname. And they came out of Venice. So then again, how did all of this happen? And then we have the Jews from Italy and the names of the families from the Jews of Italy that connect up into all of this. Now, was the Sephardim exclusive to this Ashkenazi? No. My original Henriques came to Jamaica at the end of the 18th century, 1790s, and ended up marrying a woman named Franks. Now, Franks is certainly not Sephardic. Certainly not Sephardic. So when I look at my ancestry out of the village of Shepatovka in the Ukraine, with an Orthodox Jewish background, and my mother, who literally had no religious experience by living in a plantation without any access to the synagogue other than by horse and buggy, I then realized that you have a very interesting situation. I am no longer just a Jew. I'm a Jew called cafe con leche, mixed with everything, and even had 2 sugars in my cafe con leche. So there am I. And it is really quite interesting because we also find other things which are part of the genealogical experience. We find people who had been Jewish marrying people who had been Jewish. And then we come to the conclusion that there are cultural similarities in families, even though they are no longer practicing as Jews.
Yeah.
And there are also other situations where in Jamaica today, we probably have 300,000 to 400,000 Jamaicans with Jewish ancestry. And many of them actually still have value systems which relate to our value systems as being Jews. So what am I telling you now? I'm telling you very simply that we are a unique Jewish community in the Caribbean, and it's very, very pleasant to be able to help people even get their citizenship in Portugal.
Can I ask about doing the research that the Jewish records were largely destroyed when the synagogue burnt down, or a lot of Kingston burnt down in, I think, 1882. How were you doing your research? I mean, what sources were you using? Because this is mostly in the pre-internet age.
The Jewish records started, or the ones which were retained, started in approximately 1807 and 1797. The Ashkenazi or English and German congregation were the earlier ones that were saved, and then the Sephardic ones were the ones that were recovered at the beginning of the 19th century, What we had was an amazing woman here by the name of Phyllis Delissa. And the name Delissa is also an interesting name, because a lot of the old Portuguese used to think that Delissa was a Sephardic name. And we think we have found through the DNA that Delissa came from Lisa. And it's when they got here that the Portuguese said, you're from Lisa, Delissa, from Lisa. And that's how the name occurred. But anyway, leave that alone and let us speak to this woman, Phyllis Delissa. And she took these records and she chronologically recorded them. And that was in itself an amazing event that I used extensively. The birth, deaths, and marriage records of the Jamaican people were also copied and given to the archives. But we didn't use the archives because that's not easily accessible. The other thing which was interesting was that the record of births, deaths, and marriages were done largely through the church vestry records from the English captured Jamaica in 1655, and when the vestries were established. And these have now been, shall we say, they have been microfilmed by the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And that access is now available online. So that becomes another story of access. The third access story is that in 1880, it became mandatory for all records of birth, marriages, and deaths to be handled by the government of the time. So that gives us 140 years plus of records to start with. Also copied by the Mormons and all available online. So I don't have to get up from where I'm sitting talking to you literally to do my research, which is absolutely wonderful. I also have 2 very good friends who are the other 2 major genealogists of Jamaica, neither Jewish, by the way, But we do share a lot of information. And if something needs to be researched more deeply in a particular, in the government record office, I can say, hey, please. And I do get answers. So this is all part of the story. Now, I also mentioned Stern, and I also mentioned Bevis Marks, and I have Jamaican families which I have found in the Bevis Marks record and also in the Stern records. So yes, we have been, shall we say, caught by these various exercises. And then there's the Cincinnati records, which I have not done as much work in as I should have done or could have done. But give it what it is, it's not quite as difficult as it sounds if you begin to understand the nuances of how the records are kept.
So sorry, the Cincinnati records, I'm not aware of those. What are those?
The Jewish historical work was originally recorded in Cincinnati.
Oh, okay, yes.
And that was work done in the at the beginning of the 20th century. So again, that predates the damage to something. Oh, and the other point, and I nearly forgot to tell you, is that I happen to have ended up with two very important friends. One, Rachel Frankel, and another, Aviva Ben-Ur, who did the seminal work on the Jordan Savannah cemeteries. And as a result of their work and the publication of their books, I was able to become a very close friend of Rachel Frankel. As a result of that, over the last 14 years or so, we have cataloged every Jewish grave that we can find in Jamaica. And you have to recognize that at one stage, Mordecai Arbel identified that there were 21 Jewish cemeteries. Today, we only have 14 because we have unfortunately sold and had others destroyed for whatever economic purposes. But it has given us a tremendous background with the cataloging we have done on these cemeteries, primarily with volunteers coming from different parts of the world to work with Rachel on the cataloging, photography, measurement, etc. And this is I would claim that we actually completed the Jewish records of cemeteries in Jamaica before they did in Israel.
Okay, we've had...
That's my boast.
I have a question about that. There's the book by R.D. Barnett. And
oh, yes, I have it right here beside me.
Yes. And did Rachel Franks discover more graves than
oh, yes.
Yes?
Barnett's records were done in the 1950s. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that Barnett didn't do a lot of the work himself because it was Barnett and Wright. And Wright did a lot of the work. Okay? I happen to know a little bit about it because I know Barnett's widow. She's a friend of mine.
Of course.
So that's part of it. And what we found is that some of the recording was not as accurate as we have found it on the tombstones. But it's not a question that it wasn't an important work. It was an important work. It is an important work. But it helps us also to find where the tombstones were buried, or where the people were buried, because we know the cemeteries and we know the rows, and Barnett's work in that sense was very, very important.
Will Rachel Franks' work be published, or will it be online at some point in the future?
That is a test that we are going through at the moment. The question is what to do with the data, what is to do with the information. Do we hand it over to Jewish Gen? Do we give it to MyHeritage? What do we do with the data? And it's the conversations we are having right now, because we've finished the cataloging. It's a question now of translating it into the kind of information that can be accessed by computer digitally. So it's in a discussion stage. Let's put it that way. The data is there, but it's in a discussion stage as to how we use it. So that's really my story at the moment. And in fact, I think it's only 2 days ago I spoke with Rachel about it.
Well, perhaps we can get her to speak to her, because Aviva Ben-Ur, she spoke to us a few months ago about Suriname.
Yes, absolutely. And the work they did there was outstanding.
Yes,
outstanding.
absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Yes. I ran into Rachel back when we had the first conference in at the Brown Library. And I have to backtrack a little bit because part of the encouragement and guidance I've had over these last 40 odd years is a fellow named Mordecai Arbel.
Yes.
And Mordecai Arbel turned up in Jamaica. Well, I'd met him some in the 70s in Curacao. He was in Panama, Israeli ambassador to Panama. But then he turned up in 1980, working on the exhibition which was eventually put out called La Nación. And that's at the Betaput Sot. And yes, you can find my name in it, but that's only because I was working with him. And only because I worked with him in Jamaica. That in itself is another fascinating story. And he was really the first person, I think, who was trying to put together the understanding of a Caribbean Jewish migration, or the migration to the Caribbean, and how we all handled our various communities. And as a result of that, in Israel, in Jerusalem one day with him, he said, "This is the manuscript on the Portuguese Jews of Jamaica. What do you think?" I took it from him. I loved it. And I had it published by the United Congregation of Israelites in Jamaica, the Sherry Shalom Synagogue. And it is still selling. That's the good news. It's still selling. There are people still looking for the Portuguese Jews of Jamaica. And I'm one of them.
So something, I mean, to return to a point that you made earlier, I mean, something that I pick up is there seems to be a lot of interest amongst, I don't know if it's just Jamaicans in the UK or, you know, people of Jamaican ancestry in the UK, but Jamaica seems to be a bit of a hotspot within Sephardic genealogy. And I wonder if you can think of any reason for that, why there does seem to be a lot of interest there.
Well, I put it to you another way. Before I started, there was no interest. I had no idea, other than who my grandmother told me who her father was. Yeah. Not her great-grandmother, not her grandmother. I had no interest other than knowing my mother knew her grandfather. And where did they come from? And we're still not sure, put it bluntly, because we think they're Austro-German origin. But they turned up here in the 1780s. And they were part of the English and German congregation. So again, I would have to go back. So what is the interest of it has now become the fact that we've exposed these stories by virtue of the Delgado story, the Isaac Levy story, my own stories, because mine is not one story. And so as a result, people have become much more interested in their family histories. And I'm very happy for that. Not only Jews, but even people who have Jewish ancestry, yes, or even people who have no known Jewish ancestry. I don't have a problem as far as I'm concerned. People are people.
Jamaicans, though, they seem to be great travelers. I mean, like the Sephardim, I keep encountering, for example, people who've gone from Jamaica to Panama and then perhaps onto the United States, and from Jamaica, obviously, here to the UK and everywhere. I don't know if that's just an island thing or if there might be some.
But these are a lot of economic issues, not really religious issues. And I go one step further. There's a place in Newport called the Turo Synagogue. You know where Rabbi Isaac Turo is buried?
Yeah, I've been there.
In Jamaica.
Yeah.
Huntsville. So that's all part of why did we move from here to there? And that's part of what you've identified is really interesting, because today the majority of the Jewish population from Jamaica is either to be found in Vancouver, Miami, or Toronto. And that's economic.
Yeah.
No, some will argue that it's political, and why people move from one country to another. Another part of that story is basically the opportunities that these places offer. I have 3 daughters. None of them live in Jamaica any longer. They all went to college in America. And my grandchildren similarly. And it's sad in a way, because that history has no future in Jamaica other than the recorded history, which I'm talking to you about and I've done with the genealogy. So it's really quite sad in that sense. And it's probably the same thing when you look at where we came from. Where we came from Amsterdam, where we came from Portugal. Where did we come from before that? And so the losses of our history is what we are trying to recapture in a sense, which is why I think genealogy is so important.
Yes.
So that's part of my story.
Tom.
I'm willing to help anybody who wants to find something that relates to who they are. And gives them a sense of belonging. Because again, we're dealing with another story, and I'm going to move from genealogy, from Judaism to another issue. The issue is that a lot of the people who have come out of enslavement have no real sense of belonging unless they have some family history to relate to, and go even further back into which part of Africa and what tribes they were brought from. So this is important, very important. And I'm not sure that we understand it as a society or societies in the world today, certainly in the Western Hemisphere.
Talking about enslaved people, and that was actually something we probably weren't going to talk about, but it's an important subject and an interesting subject. I've recently heard two different stories specifically to do with the Lindo family, that in some families, people who had the, for want of a better word, Sephardic surnames were descended from Sephardim. But I've heard it claimed that, for example, the Lindos who owned lots of slaves gave their surnames to slaves, so that people called Lindo may not actually have Sephardic origins. Is that true, or do you know anything about that? Or?
Yes, I do know something about it, because one of the things is that if you came here with a Swahili name, and you wanted to also recognize or be recognized as somebody working within the English language, the easiest thing for you to do was to adopt an English name. One of the classic stories that I have is years ago, indentured Indians came to Jamaica after the emancipation, and I picked up an old gentleman in Port Royal, and was driving him to his home in Kingston, and he told me his name, and I was able to tell him the village that he grew up in, because his ancestors had worked on a plantation which had been owned by the Baker family on the edge of that village. And I knew it wasn't his Indian name, so I knew where he'd come from and where the name of his ancestors was changed from whatever it was in Indian to Baker. And by the way, that Baker family was the people who founded the first shipment of bananas out to the United States about 160 years ago. So again, my history, my other interest in history has helped me significantly to understand and grasp some of the sociological issues. So that's part of it. Yes, they did adopt names that were related to English and the landowner and the slave master.
So is there any way of...
1 second, I have a dog trying to get into... 1 second.
Oh.
A little dog was scratching on the door.
Okay. So is there any way of telling if somebody was of Sephardic origin or had ancestors who were enslaved by somebody of Sephardic origin?
Well, once you have a name that can be registered in the system I mentioned earlier, then it's not hard to trace back the Jewish ancestry in that family. Yes. What we don't have, and what we have not done enough of, in my view, is a DNA recognition of where people are come from. So I have a particular interesting beef, and any Jamaican listening will understand my beef. Columbus turned up here in 1494 on his fourth voyage, right? And he lived here for over a year, and he brought nearly 100 young men who we think were the sons of the conversos of Sevilla. And for over a year, I'm pretty sure that they mingled with not only the indigenous Taino people, but subsequently with the people who fled slavery and became Maroons. And I'm dying to have those people DNA tested to see how much Sevilla bloodlines are in their ancestry.
Well, Adam Brown of the Taino DNA Project is in this meeting, and he's just written, "We're ready, willing, and able to participate, Ainsley." So if you can find some candidates.
I'll talk to him afterwards.
Okay.
But it's just an interesting story,
Yeah.
because, you know, how people migrate, how people mingle, and what kind of relationships exist are really quite fascinating. And again, you know, this is.
I would be very much interested to know what sources there are for the Spanish period of Jamaica.
There is a book.
1500 to 1656, I believe.
Yes,
So where are all the church records, the records of monasteries, town records? What happened to them? Is there anything known about that? Were they taken by the Spanish? Did they stay in Jamaica and get lost? I don't believe the English had an interest in those records because they couldn't read them. So
well,
I
I've been
hope
interested.
that something survived.
As you know, I've been chairman of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust on and off for a number of years. So all of this is fascinating to me. We're at the origins of our people. What is our culture? How has our culture evolved? And then we have a national motto, out of many one. And I argue it's out of many cultures, one culture. So that was what was registered as the national motto at the time when it was done. I argue that it should have been different, slightly different. And so what it comes down to is the fact that we have our national dish being curry goat. We have Saturday soup, which is a Jewish tradition. And I continue with that kind of cultural intervention. But at the same time, we have the Spanish history of Jamaica, which was written by Morales Padron. And he was of the University of Sevilla, I think. Jamaica was actually owned by the Colon family. It never had a large population. In fact, Padron speaks to the fact that the population was not more than about 10,000. All right, let me get it right. 10,000 people, half of whom left Jamaica. Was it as much as 10,000? I think it was less than 10,000. I think
European people.
Yeah. Of everybody. The Taino indigenous people died for a very simple reason: European disease. They were dead within 30 years. There was 60,000 that disappeared. There may be one or two families that claim to be Taino today, but they disappeared. They died. So the Spanish, when the English arrived, it was only a very small number of people living in the island, and half of them were considered to be Portugals or conversos or origin. And they never left. They became the transition population because they never had a proper church in Jamaica, and they never had Inquisition. So there was no question of that. We were growing horses and cattle for the conquistadors on 12 estates, 12 open estates, no fences, open estates. It's a whole fascinating story, which is totally different from Latin America or Central America, totally different. So you're asking a question which everybody would normally assume is that, there were 30,000 people in the island or 40,000 people. No way. And the fight that took place over 3 years with a guerrilla group of Spaniards ended with their fleeing to Cuba from the Battle of Rio Nuevo. And I was privileged to open the exhibition at the Battle of Rio Nuevo. And of course, I had to speak in the national language of the time. So I addressed the crowd in Spanish and then converted to English because I was only reading from the paper. So it's part of the fun I've had with the whole concept of the Jamaican history. And it's really quite different from what I think most people recognize in the traditional way that histories are written, because nobody really writes about 10 or 12,000 or a few thousand people in a country the size of Jamaica.
Well, there must
So
be.
if the records are there, Ton, they could be in Santiago de Cuba. They could be. We don't know.
That would be interesting. There must also be records in Spain itself. Spain
Could be
had
as well, yeah.
large archives, and there are the colonial archives in Sevilla. There
We've
must
had
be.
one Jamaican that has searched those records, and we haven't. She did not find them. So that's why I came back to the concept that they may be in the church records in Santiago de Cuba, because that's where they fled to when they left Jamaica in 1668, I think it was 1658, 58, 59. But it's a good question. It's a good question, and it's a question that, you know, if people really want to know how and what, they should really start that kind of research.
Yes. I believe someone wrote a little book. I believe the former archivist of Jamaica around 1907. And he wrote a book based on research in the archives in Sevilla. And there was this lady who dug through the archives and provided all kinds of information about Jamaica mentioned in the colonial archives in Sevilla. It's a very small book. It's no longer than 70 pages or so, but it's full of interesting information. But I would have to look up the title.
I'm aware of it, and I have not read it, but I'm aware of it, and that's an important point you've made, because it's an important source that needs to be checked.
It is online.
Somebody else has indicated that Cartagena could also be a site, but I don't think so, because Cartagena became a major trading post for Jamaican Jewry in the beginning of the 19th century. And the purpose of that exercise was to be able to smuggle European goods into Latin America. And there were two major sites for smuggling goods from. One was Jamaica and the other one was Curacao. I know a little bit about the smuggling capabilities of what we were up to, but I must apologize. I never did smuggle anything.
That's that little booklet that I mentioned is the source of the story about 30 Portugals who were asked in 1530 to come to Jamaica. And it was a request done by the governor of Jamaica to the King of Spain. He asked for 30 Portugals, preferably farm people, who would be able to help get an economic development in Jamaica. But the book also says that it's not really known if these 30 Portugals were sent.
But what we have, you know, it's an important point you're making. In 1517, there were the building started, and it was completed, the first sugar mill in Jamaica, owned by Garay, the governor, who was the person you're talking about. And we know that there was somewhere between 15 and 20 Portugals who landed in what is now known as the Old Harbor Bay and came to work on the Garay sugar mill. Now I'm going to share something else with you. The Garay sugar mill has been incredibly importantly archaeologically investigated. And one of the sad parts of Jamaica is that we have not yet put in the effort to restore that site as the oldest sugar mill in the Western Hemisphere. It's a sad story, because it is a water-driven water wheel, and it just needs to be able to tell the story of what the Colon family tried to do, but never succeeded in creating an estate, a sugar estate. Plantation
after
people.
the Spanish came the English, and the English brought the Jews with them, as far as we know. But the relationship between the English colonizers and the Jews wasn't always friendly, so to say. Jews felt that they were overtaxed, and at several points they tried to be recognized as equal to Englishmen. What can you tell us about that period?
Well, I can tell you that you're absolutely correct. It took quite a long time for Jews living in Jamaica to be recognized as full citizens. That took place only in 1831. So from 1656, 57 till 1831, we were considered second-class citizens. And anytime we got too active in the business of mercantilism or anything else, or even we didn't own many plantations, but even plantation ownership, we would find that the British plantocracy or merchants would complain to what we were doing, and we were taking away their livelihoods and this, that, and t'other. So a lot of our early activities were based in settling in different parts of the island, mainly along the coast, because that was the only real way of transporting goods. That's the only. My great-grandfather actually owned a wharf in Morant Bay, and that was his business. So that part of it was before they had motor cars, and the only other way to travel was either by horse or by buggy. So yes, the Jews settled all over the island, and that's one of the reasons why we have so many small cemeteries, and where families grew and also integrated in many ways, both in terms of religion and in terms of the relationships that they had with other natives, as it were. So yes, it creates a big story, and a sense of understanding how we moved, why we moved, how did we practice Judaism? Did we practice Judaism? Did we have prayers? Did we just say we were Jews? Were we the bodies brought into the other centers where there were cemeteries? There are all sorts of questions which have a lot of answers to really focus on, and you can only deal with them on an individual by individual basis. And I hope in that sense I've covered what your questioning was about. It was very important.
In view of the absence of synagogue records for the 18th century and earlier, what are the main sources that one can use to get beyond 1813 to find more about Jewish ancestors in that time? I believe there are
the British were very good at keeping records. And so the Legislative Council and the records of the British governance are primarily our main source of that. There are one or two people who turned up for a variety of reasons, and also wrote significant tracts of history. And they did actually end up by also meeting with and talking to people who had Jewish interest and Jewish religion. So there is that kind of story that can be brought out, and there was people like Long, and I can name other names, but that's a whole reading exercise. But what is also interesting is that from the 1830s, with the prior to emancipation, prior to the freedom of slavery, prior to the freedom of people who were of color, who were also not considered, who were free people but not considered full citizens, there has been a significant amount of research done by the University of West Indies historians. So there is some more recent text and research on these people and the legislation and what took place over those years prior to emancipation, full free emancipation in 1838.
Because before we started broadcasting, we were discussing Stan Mervis's research the wills of Jamaica, which I think is a fantastic piece of work. He also spoke to us a few months ago. We have hundreds of questions, and I'm afraid we're just ignoring them because we've got having too much fun here. But Ellie was asking twice. Was the Maroon Territory Jewish cemetery ever discovered?
Sorry, the Maroon?
There was Ellie is saying there was a Jewish cemetery in Maroon Territory, and was that cemetery ever discovered in the jungle?
No,
Okay.
We don't have a cemetery in the Maroon territories. What we have is a history of the Maroons, who we worked as Jews, we worked with because we helped to protect them when they needed to be able to fight with the British. So they recognized in the history of the Maroon people, and I happen to have that story, I know that story. They were not against us, they were with us. Okay, they were with the Jews that were in their communities or near their communities. But to the best of my knowledge, they were not, we did not have any cemetery relationship with them.
Okay.
That's one issue. Yes, go ahead.
No, David Simon was asking an interesting question about relationships between different communities within the Caribbean. Did the Portuguese nation, as it were, consider itself one community, or was Jamaica separate from Curacao, separate from Barbados, and so forth?
You know, that's an important question. And one argues and asks why not, but there's very little evidence that we traveled from island to island, from Curacao to Jamaica. Maybe somebody went down there and saw a nice girl and decided to get married and blah, blah, blah. That's a different story. But there was very little that I can trace between the islands. Barbados, which was the oldest Jewish settlement in the New World, 1626, I think it was, that eventually died out and in the 1920s and was restored, and the synagogue is now a beautiful museum and center. Didn't have very much, again, because assimilation issue was more important than seeking relationships with other people, unless you had cousins that you were trading with or had relationships with in the sense of business and exporting and importing goods. That's the way I understand it today. So if they were in England, yes, because they had open businesses in England to be able to trade with Jamaica, and English Jews with Jamaican cousins also did the similar sort of exercise. One of the interesting things is that one of the earliest Jamaican Jewish Henriques was Jacob Henriques, and his descendants include Basil and Robert Henriques of English fame from Jamaica. But I can't connect with them, so I can't claim Basil as a cousin. I tried once before, it didn't work. And so the story really is that my ancestor turned up here from Amsterdam, and maybe because he had a cousin in Jamaica that wrote and said you should come. So we don't know.
One of the more colorful people within the world of Sephardic genealogy is Ed Kritzler, who wrote Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's interesting. Everybody who knew him seems to have absolutely loved this guy, but been slightly cautious about talking about his work. I mean, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about him and his book.
Before I come to that, though, David, I want to just mention I forgot to complete the story on Stan Mervis. Yeah. And Stan Mervis came to Jamaica through my associate and their friend Jane Gerber, yeah, and as an undergraduate. And he has lived in and out of with me and with everything that I have done and what he has instituted, to the point where I am very, very proud of what he has done. And his work on the Jewish tombs, the Jewish wills is extraordinary, extraordinary. Yeah. And I can only claim that I did help with that, but not to read the wills, to help to collect it. No, it's done some extraordinarily important work. And the other, coming back now to Ed Critzer. Eddie turned up here, in the 60s, I think, working for the Jamaica Tourist Board. I never met Eddie until basically, I would think the 80s, early 80s. Because he flew up and down like a I don't know, like a man all over the world, okay? And he was originally out of New York, but he had a tremendous interest in history, and in particular in Jamaican history. So I think he completed his, literally complete, not quite completed, but he was on his second wife at the time, and spent a lot of time in Negril, in the Negril area. But anytime he got bored with what he had found and what he was writing about, he'd turn up in my house. And so I can tell you something. I sit on my veranda today and I say, Eddie, I miss you, because we had wonderful conversations. And we fought like cat and dog over his interpretation of history. And so I think that one of the more important aspects of Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean was that it gave us a sense that we didn't just lie down and take the Inquisition or take the Holocaust for what it delivered to us, but we fought back to be able to capture the gold and silver of other people when we needed to. And the other part of the equation, which he didn't, I think, do him justice to, is that much of the, I would argue, much of the trading of the capture of loot was done by the Jews of Port Royal. But then don't say I say so.
Ton, do you have any?
Well,
Ton should reach for his smelling
No,
salts.
I love Eddie's book, and it was fascinating, fascinating.
I think he was a likable fellow, but I'm not convinced.
He was a delight. He was a delight. And you know what was sad? I'll share this other thought. When the book came out and it was so well received, Eddie was now going to organize his life as a speaking tour around the States and other parts of the world. And unfortunately, he developed cancer and didn't last that long.
I'm not convinced about the historical quality of his work. There are colorful stories, but I've spent a lot of time checking his sources, and the sources often say other things than Critzer makes it.
I couldn't say that. He was my friend. I allow you to say it.
Thank you.
Eddie and I did fight considerably over the value or the authenticity of some of the stories that he put forward. But it's a good story. It's a good. Life is full of coincidences. And one of the interesting coincidences, I was in the Sheriff Israel Shabbat service some years ago, and the rabbi said, I'm going to have a talk after the service, if you'd like to stay and gather, and I'm going to talk about something I've just recently read. It was Eddie's book. and so my cousin introduced me to the rabbi and said, this is the guy who's mentioned in the book. So I became famous because of Eddie, not in spite of Eddie.
Yes.
So that's another story. No, it's a good book. It's a good book. And you know that it's a good book in the sense that it tells a story, and it's not a direct, dry historical exercise, as you rightly indicate. It has interpretations.
I think there are not very many pirates in the book, though.
Not what? Your family?
No, not many pirates.
Oh, the pirates. Hey, look, I wouldn't go too far into that.
Okay, that's fair enough.
You know, and quite honestly, what it did, it helped also to do, is because I go further. I go back to my days in England. One of my dearest friends in England was a family. The wife was actually from Portugal, sorry, from Poland, and was in Lisbon, and was the person who sent the cable to Churchill to allow 260 of the first 260 people, Jewish people, to be shipped from Lisbon to what is now the University College, or the University of the West Indies campus, which was considered to be the Gibraltar camp. Okay, so I have a whole other set of stories of what took place in Lisbon, what took place in the Western Hemisphere with the Holocaust, without actually having to have only read the numbers on people's sleeves that show hands that had been marked. I also have been privileged to have had Eva Schloss speak to us in Jamaica, to the largest gathering of Jamaicans that I've ever seen in a hotel. So they wanted to know the story. It's fascinating, and this was 2 years ago. So you know, it tells a lot of different things as to how we should live in communities as Jews, and how we should behave as Jews. And I won't speak any further on that, because I know that a lot of people in the rest of the world will throw me out.
And there are a few more questions in chat. David
Please.
Simon asks about your Pereira Mendes ancestors. Were you able to trace them back to Portugal?
No, I only picked them up from their arrival in Montego Bay and their ethnization as Jamaicans or British citizens. I did not go back to Portugal. I had difficulty both with Portugal. Until I met you, I didn't even know anybody that spoke Dutch. So that's another story. And so I wasn't good at Portuguese, and I didn't know where to begin. And I wasn't that kind of commitment to the genealogy. I did not actually find the Belinfanti story. I recorded it from another researcher when they left Istanbul, when they left Lisbon to go to Istanbul in 1497. So I'm not the origin of that research either. And that's a little bit of plagiarization, but it's part of what you do with genealogy.
There's another interesting question from Sandra de Levante.
Yes.
A very Jamaican name, if I'm right.
You're right.
She asked, did the Jamaican Jews in the 18th and 19th century customarily have ketubot?
What, ketubas?
Ketubas.
Yes, of course. Of course. There's a ketuba book in the synagogue. Okay. And if she wants to find out if we have the ketuba of a relative, I can look it up. Now, how far back it goes, I don't think it goes back before the 18th century.
Certainly, and that's a collection of
19th century, because again, we're looking at the damage that took place. In 1882, there was a fire of Kingston, and every synagogue was destroyed. So the records that were enclosed or encapsulated in those synagogues was destroyed. And that's the real story. The synagogue we have now, and I can show you pictures of it, which was built in 1880, after the 1882 fire, was also damaged again in 1907 with the earthquake, and when restored. So the hurricanes and the fires and the earthquakes are part of what we have to live with, and how we have to try to protect our history and our heritage. So I don't think we'll find a ketubah that goes back much before 1882.
And there's another question from David Simon. It has been said that Jamaica provided more wealth to the British Crown than any other possession in the New World. Is that why so many Jews who came to the Americas ended up there?
Well, let me share a very interesting little story with you. The government of Britain sent to restore the English or the British home of the British not ambassadors, what do you call them? Anyway, and I was invited to be at the opening. and I was invited to speak. And the Commonwealth Secretary General, or whatever it was, came to speak. And in my conversation, public conversation, I said exactly what you have just repeated. Yes, our blood, sweat, and tears was what built the manor homes of Britain. That's no question. And then I said to him, did you bring the mezuzah to put on the door of the building that we've just restored? He said, no, I'll bring it next time. So yes, I don't think there's any question about that. The Beckford family, the Lord Mayors of London, dominated Jamaican plantation agriculture for nearly 100 years. In fact, the estate that I grew up on was at one time owned by them, but nobody ever lived there. So that's another part of understanding. But we've spent an awful lot of time examining the horror of enslavement and not really registering the kind of remittances that took place to the families in England. Right now, just 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, the book called The Blood Legacy has just been published. That family from Scotland owned a 1,500 acre estate for nearly over 100 years. What is interesting that the man who has written the book, and a Scottish journalist, has discovered the family records for over 150 years in his grandfather's garage. And he used that to create the book, Blood Legacy. And it's an amazing story of an estate over the 18th century that provided wealth to the Scottish family that owned it. So yes, that's another story. It's all there. It comes out bit by bit by bit by bit. So it's a good question.
I hate to say, but we're 2 minutes short of a religious occasion here in England and also in Italy. I'm very happy to continue or Ton, what do you?
If there is interest, we can go on.
Okay.
My answer is simply no. Let the best team win.
Well, that will be the Italians, unfortunately.
There are a few more questions on chat.
Yeah, I'm comfortable. I'm sitting at home.
Yeah. Are the transcriptions you mentioned of the surviving synagogue records available? The originals are on Family Search, but they are very hard to read.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
Are there better copies or are there transcriptions?
Oh, what's on Family Search?
Synagogue records. I don't know what is meant by them. I assume that these may be birth records.
No, Family Search are primarily what do you call it, microfilmed, and then put on to the Family Search program. I think they're what's the word I want? Transcribed to the Family Search program. But the expert on all of this, of course, is Stan Mervis.
Okay. And Gina Mark says hello. She she remembers how you work together. She still has some questions, but maybe you can email to work it out. It seems
I'm here. I'm here. Anytime they want to go and watch football, they're welcome. I'm here as long as you guys keep me on.
And one tells about the Gomez Caceres family, some of whom went to Jamaica and settled there and are buried there. That's not really a question. David, are there also questions on YouTube?
That is a good question. I'm afraid, due to my technical ineptitude, I'm afraid I can't see them at the moment. I'm sorry.
Okay. And Gina also remembers that she worked with you on the Jewish members of the Masonic lodges of Montego Bay. And David is always interested in Masonic.
That's an interesting new introduction of the Jews were very active in the Masonic Lodge. In fact, I think we even claim that it was the Jews that introduced Masonry to the United States. But I am not the expert in Masonry, okay? So I really am only speaking, and you just heard literally the limit of my knowledge. But there are one very important active Jew in Masonry still in Jamaica, and I'll be happy to send any questions to him to get answers. He's not Grand Master, but he's a significant master, former master of the congregation of the Masonic community. I did join the Masonry, but I didn't continue with the Masonry for personal reasons, nothing to do with Masonry, but to do with my own circumstances.
Important question. What is your relationship to Errol Flynn?
All right. No, well, I happened to have been taken to the Titchfield Hotel in Port Antonio. And I was dog paddling in the pool. And the lady came up to me and said, "Young man, would you like to learn the Australian call?" And I said, "Yes, I would love to." And she taught me the Australian call. As a result of that, I became a very good swimmer. I swam for my school, and I swam for my university. But I smoked too much, so I never continued after that. I don't smoke anymore. So that's a true story. That's a true introduction to who I am. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn lived in Port Antonio when he was in Jamaica, and his widow was a friend of mine until she died a few years ago. So yes, I did know the family. I did not know the professor. I did not know the professor, or only met his mother, or rather, not his father, but I met his mother only because she taught me how to swim for a week that I was in the hotel.
Okay. I'm almost through the questions now. There was a book about the Jamaica and the Cayman Islands by Jackie Ranston.
Yes.
About Masonic Jamaica and the Cayman Islands.
Yes.
And many thank yous for your interview with us.
Was that Jackie? Hi, Jackie. You're a very good friend.
Well, this was not from Jackie, but from Hakon.
Okay.
Another question. Do you know if Donald Lindo's genealogy CD is still available to conduct research?
Yes, I know who it was. Donald Lindo was the man that brought me in to the genealogical concept of working with a database on computer. Before that, I would not have started it because I had no real capacity to do the kind of recording manually. And so I give a lot of credit to the late Donald Lindo. And his database is, I happen to have one of his database CDs, and the person who inherited it from him is also one of my dear genealogical friends. So yes, it's available if requested.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Donald, let me explain one other thing. I tended to work mostly with families, family connections. Donald collected data from a number of different sources, like cemetery records and personality books. And so his linkage within the family was not as defined as my linkages, but he was an amazing source of of collected data.
A related question, what kind of software do you use to
I use
handle?
Brothers. I started with Brothers Keeper, introduced by Donald Lind, and I still use Brothers Keeper.
And what sort of software do you use now to
That's it.
handle tens of thousands of names?
Brothers Keeper.
Brothers Keeper.
Yeah, I haven't changed. You know, I know why I'm not going to change easily. I'm afraid of technology. But it's also, my database is on cloud, so that hopefully, if anything happens here, I can find it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I've now mastered YouTube, and there is an interesting question there about the relationship between Jamaica and I think the question is specifically about the continental United States and the relationships between these two territories.
No, that's the Jewish relationship is interesting. As I earlier discussed, Jamaica prior to Jamaica was a more important economic center for Britain than America, obviously. What happened was that a number of Jewish families also migrated to or settled in the southern United States in the early days. We have to remember that Port Royal was a more important trading center than a little town called New Amsterdam, which became New York. And the earthquake of 1692 was a major blow to that part of the Jamaican story, economic story, because it destroyed a tremendous amount of damage, did a lot of damage, and Jews and everybody else in Port Royal, which was very, very important with a town of 8,000 people. So what you also find is that there were Jews that settled in New Orleans, but not in any great number for a variety of reasons. The major Jew that settled in New Orleans was a Delgado from Falmouth, who was a sugar trader, and his ancestor was his descendant was on the program with us today. That's him, and his work was to create the museum, the Delgado Museum in New Orleans, and major contribution. We had connections in Philadelphia, in the Delaware Valley, for a variety of reasons, not necessarily for Sephardic reasons, but Eli Gabay is probably online as well, and he will tell you that that's rubbish. So, and of course, New York was a major center for all of us, backwards and forwards for both Kingston and New York in subsequent days. I'm trying to think of some specific interests. Well, of course, the major interest for me was Henry Pereira Mendes. And of course, the other very interesting connection was the Sola family, the Sola Mendes family, who started off as a Pereira Mendes family and who were married into the David de Sola family. So that's, a whole nother story. And Jonathan 100 is still very much a delightful human being. So I love to go to New York and talk with him. Canada, we had some. New England, I don't have much to say about New England. I may be wrong, because I don't get a feeling that we had much to do with the New England communities. Certainly not in the Midwest either. I'm trying to think where else. New Orleans, yes, and of course in the Carolinas, certainly. And of course Miami was not a town anyway. That's a recent invention. Toronto, yes, we settled there too, but I can't tell you. I don't have anything outstanding in my memory that comes up about Toronto or Montreal. Or anywhere else in Canada for that matter. I may be wrong. But Jews have subsequently been, since the Second World War, to live in Canada and have done extraordinarily well. My role was in the 60s and 70s, sorry, in the 70s. I was a vice president for B'nai Brit Jewish Lodge, and I served for 10 countries. So in New Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Colombia, Curacao, blah, 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 blah. And that was, for me, fascinating people who had escaped to a certain extent from the Holocaust. Rabbi Gunther Friedlander, the secretary for the district, managed to leave Germany on crystal night. The president of the district was a man who actually was a friend of Allende, managed to go to Israel and ended up as a professor at the Hebrew University. So we had wonderful experiences of people in that experience that I had in the 70s. And, you know, they had stories that were unreal, believable, unbelievable, fascinating. So, and what they did to create and build and strengthen their own Jewish communities in those countries was fascinating. Yes. And, you know, this is all part of, I think, the understanding that Judaism is not just a Sephardi or an Ashkenazi. It's really our culture, a way of life, a value system, principles. And you don't have to be Orthodox because a Chabad rabbi in Jamaica is my friend.
One last question, Ainsley. What is your email address, if you are willing to share it?
I think anybody that doesn't know it should not be given it. I thought it was one of the most common emails out there. I managed to connect early. And so my email is ainsley@cwjamaica.com. Ainsley, just simply Ainsley, at C for Charlie, W for William, Jamaica, one word, .com. Yeah. And
I think it's time to give everyone the chance to catch up on the football.
It's 1-0 to England at the moment.
1-0 to England.
Yeah, a miracle.
Congrats.
Oh, sounds good. No, it's been a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ainsley, for talking to us.
Yes.
And thank you to our patrons who make all of this possible.
Yeah, man.
And David can announce, or shall I do that? Announce next week's speaker?
Would you announce it? But I just also like to say thank you to Ainsley. It was absolutely fascinating and great fun. And hopefully we can do this again at some time.
Anytime.
Next week's speaker will be Tirza Levi Berenfeld, who wrote the book about the Amsterdam poor and the Sephardic community. And she will talk about the Jews of the Balkan in Amsterdam. It's a fascinating story about the war in the Balkan 1690, and which caused the Belogrados, or the Balkan Jews, to flee to Amsterdam, Hamburg, and also to London. And Tirza has the story. See you all next week. Thank you.